Hi everybody, today I want to talk about this book called Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide. It talks a lot about rape and the rape culture in many societies that has become accepted. And there are a few things in here that I would like to read from the book. This is a slum in India where this woman lives, and this is the situation they're living with. In the area is called Nasubura Niger, and I will pronounce a lot of things incorrectly, and I will try my best to correct it, but right now that's not important. The woman that is in the story, her name is Mushiya Narayane, and this is the story of what's happening. Akuyadva was, in a sense, the other success of Yasubura Niger. He was a higher caste man who had turned an apprenticeship as a small-time thug into a role as a mobster and king of the slum. He ruled a gang of hoodlums who controlled Nasubura Niger, who robbed, murdered, and tortured with impunity. The Indian authorities would have prevented a gangster from preying so ruthlessly on a middle-class neighborhood. But in slums, with Dalits or low-class residents, the authorities rarely intervened except to accept cash bribes, and so gangsters sometimes emerged in such places as absolute rulers. For 15 years, Akunadvar had terrorized Nasubura Niger, shrewdly building a small business empire. One of his specialties was the threat of rape to terrorize anyone who might stand up against him. Murder left inconvenient piles of body, requiring bribes to keep the police at bay, while rape is so stigmatizing that the victims could usually be counted on to stay silent. Sexual humiliation was thus an effective and low-risk strategy to intimidate challengers and to control the community. According to neighbors in the slums, Akuyadva once raped a woman right after her wedding. Another time, he stripped a man naked and burned him with cigarettes, then forced him to dance in front of his 16-year-old daughter. They say he took one woman, a Shubagat, and tortured her in front of her daughter and several neighbors by cutting off her breasts. Then he sliced her into pieces on the streets. One of the neighbors was horrified by Asho's killing and planned to go to the police, so they butchered him as well. Akuyadvar continued his assaults. He and his men gang raped a woman named Kalima just 10 years after she gave birth, and she was so mortified that she doused herself with kerosene and burned herself to death. The gang pulled another woman out of her house when she was 7 months pregnant, stripped her naked, and raped her on the road in public view. Skipping away a little bit. Skip through what happens eventually was he tried to rape this 13-year-old. He had just raped a 13-year-old girl, and he was going around and he went to the house of Usha saying that he was going to kill her and rape her. And she said that she wouldn't if she reported to the police. But she did, and she wouldn't give in to him. Eventually, he was arrested because Usha did not give in to intimidation and decided to press charges. And so when he went to the courthouse, there were a bunch of women who were together, victims of his own. And he was being cocky and saying that he was going to rape these women again. And he mocked her, and she hit him with a slipper. And then after she hit him, it became like a flood dam. Like, apparently, they pulled chili powder from under their clothes and threw it in the faces of Akuyadvar and the 2 police officers guarding him. The police officers fled, and then the woman pulled out their knives from their clothing and began stabbing him. And they kept stabbing him, and in retaliation for cutting off one of the woman's breasts, they hacked off his penis, and they killed him. And when I tried to arrest one of the women, they would all come together saying that they all helped in killing him, because when it comes down to it, the police were not protecting them. And apparently what it says here is that when you would go to the police, they would bring the women back, or sometimes they would even rape those women because they consider them to be prostitutes. And because they're on the lower caste system, and those of you familiar with the caste system in India, even though it's technically illegal, it still carries a lot of social value. So these women are considered lower class citizens, and no one is going to help them. And that's one of the stories in here. Another one here, it takes place in Ethiopia. And this story really kind of hit me a horrible way. Apparently in this, it's about a woman named Woshet Zembe, and in the Ethiopian countryside, if a young man has an eye on a girl but does not have a bride price, the equivalent of a dowry but paid by the man, or if he doubts that the girl's family will accept him, then he and several friends kidnap the girl and he rapes her. That immediately improves his bargaining position because she is ruined and will have difficulty marrying anyone else. The risks to the boy are minimal since the girl's parents never persecute the rapist. That would aggravate the harm to their daughter's reputation and would be resented in the community as a breach of tradition. And at the time of the rape of the woman Woshet Zembe, Ethiopian law explicitly provided that a man could not be prosecuted for violating a woman or girl he later married. And so the situation with her was that they kidnapped her and they raped this girl, this young girl. I think they said she was about 16 at the time. And they raped her and they kept her and she escaped. The guy who kidnapped her was this boy who liked her and everything, but she escaped and she refused to marry him. She was going to report the rape as a crime. The people in the village kept telling her and her father, because her father wasn't having it. Her father was like, no, we're pressing charges. This is not happening to my child. The elders and the people in the village kept pressing him to accept like the cows and stuff as payment for the girl's hand in marriage to marry her rapist, but they refused. And the parents, like even the father, refused to suggest such a thing. And Arabu, who was the guy the rapist, he and his family were afraid of getting criminal charges. So because of that, they kidnapped this girl again and rape her again. But she escapes again. And she didn't want to marry anyone. She just wanted to stay in school, get her education. So every time she escaped, they would have it happen again. And she went to court, and it says, at a court hearing, the judge told Woshet, he wants to marry you. Why are you refusing? Finally, the judge sentenced Abaru to 10 years in prison, but a month later, for reasons that are unclear, the judge released him. This is one talking about honor killings. Du Ashawad was a beautiful girl living in northern Iraq. She was 17 years old when she fell in love with a Sunni Arab boy. One night she stayed out with him. No one knows if they actually slept together, but the family assumed that they had. When Da'u returned the next morning, she saw the rage in her family and ran to seek shelter in the home of a tribal elder. But religious leaders and her own family insisted that she must die. So 8 men stormed the elder's house and dragged her out into the street as a large crowd gathered around her. And it took her 30 minutes to die because they stoned her to death. And they talk about it, and it just was horrible. But I think what hurt me the most was this story. The world capital of rape is the Eastern Congo. Militias consider it risky to engage in firefights with other gunmen, so instead they assault civilians. They discover that the most cost-effective way to terrorize civilian population is to conduct rapes of stunning brutality. Frequently, the Congolese militia rape women with sticks or knives or bayonets, or else they fire their guns into the women's vaginas. In one instance, soldiers raped a 3-year-old girl and then fired their guns into her. When the surgeon saw her, there was no tissue left to repair, and the little girl's grief-stricken father then committed suicide. All the militias here rape women to show their strength and show your weakness. In other places, there is rape because the soldiers want a woman. Here, it is that, but also a viciousness, a mentality of hatred, and it's women who pay the price. We say women, but the victims are not adults. They are girls of 14, even children of 6. In 2008, the United Nations formally declared rape a weapon of war, and Congo came up constantly in discussions. One of these Congolese victims is Dina, a 17-year-old girl from the town of Kindu. She wore a blue skirt and bright multicolored skirt as she told us her story. 1 out of 6 children, Dina grew up working on her parents' farm, growing bananas and beans. 2 of her brothers attended school, but none of the daughters didn't. Because in those cultures, you're supposed to educate the boys, not the girls. Then the Hutu militia came, and one day, because of danger, Dina cut short her work in her bean field and headed back home before sunset. She was walking home. 5 Hutu militia members surrounded her. They had guns and sticks and forced her to the ground. One of them was carrying a stick. "If you cry out, we will kill you," one of them told Dina, so she kept quiet as one by one the 5 men raped her. Then they held her down as one of them shoved the stick inside of her. When Dina didn't come home, her father and friends bravely went out into the fields, where they found her half dead in the grass. They covered her and carried her back to her home. There was a health center in Kindu, but Dina's family could not afford to take her there to be treated, so she was cared for only at home. She laid paralyzed in her bed, unable to walk. The stick had broken into her bladder and rectum, causing a fistula or hole in the tissues. As a result, urine and feces trickled constantly through her vagina and down her legs. "My people had no tribal conflict with them," Dina said of the soldiers. "Their only purpose was to rape me and leave me bleeding and leaking waste." But another thing they talk about is not just women in terms of how they're treated when it comes to sex and rape, but also childbirth. It says Prudence had been, which is the name of the girl here, Prudence had been living with her family in the village 75 miles away from, let's see, it's in Cameroon. She had no prenatal care when she was pregnant. She went into labor at full term, assisted by a traditional birth attendant who had no training. But Prudence's cervix was blocked, and the baby couldn't come out. After 3 days of labor, the birth attendant sat on Prudence's stomach and jumped up and down. That ruptured Prudence's uterus. The family paid a man with a motorcycle to take Prudence to the hospital. The hospital's doctor realized that she needed an emergency cesarean, but he wanted $100 for the surgery, and Prudence's husband and parents said they could only raise $20. The doctor was sure they were lying and could pay more. It says, Dr. Pee-Pee came, I'm calling Pee-Pee because I don't even like him, so I don't care. Dr. Pee-Pee came across as bitter, angry at the woman, and also at himself for being stuck in a remote provincial backwater. He was utterly unsympathetic to her needs. She had been lying there untreated for 3 days, according to her family. Only 2 days, the doctor said. Like, it makes a fucking difference. The fetus had died shortly after she arrived at the hospital and was now decaying and slowly poisoning her body. If they had intervened right away, my baby would still be alive, Prudence's husband said. And they just kept saying, he says, save my wife. He pleaded, my baby is dead, save my wife. And the staff were irritated at them being angry about this. And one of the senior nurses said, most of the time in emergencies, the family doesn't pay, they just run away. The doctor says that without intervention, Prudence only had hours to live and that he could operate on her if he had the remaining $80 from the $20 that they rose. So, the people who wrote the book agreed to pay the fee, and then the operation have it. And then he said that Prudence was probably anemic and would need a blood transfusion to get through a C-section. And she's type A, and there was a guy who was type O, so they gave her blood. And they handed in some money, they had the operation. And then by 10 p.m. that day, they asked where the doctor was, and the doctor said he went out the back door. He's gone home. He'll operate tomorrow, probably. And by tomorrow, it'd be too late, they said, which is obvious if she's been sitting there for 2 to 3, doesn't matter, days with a decaying fetus in her body. What they implied is that if they get him, go to his house, and bring him there to do the surgery, they don't know what he would do with his scalpel. That he could kill her just out of spite. Which is what they imply in this passage. But if we go to his house and drag him back here to do surgery, he'll be incredibly angry. Maybe he'll do the surgery, but you never know what he'll do with the scalpel. It wouldn't be good for Prudence. The only hope is to wait for morning and see if she's still alive. And then the next morning, Dr. Pee-Pee finally operated, but by then 3 days had elapsed since she arrived at the hospital. He had to remove 20 centimeters of her small intestine and had none of the powerful antibiotics needed to fight an infection. Prudence remained unconscious hours, and it wasn't just the anesthesia. She was in a coma. Her stomach expanded steadily because of the infection in her stomach, and the nurses paid no attention to her. When the bag of urine in her catheter overflowed, no one changed it. She was vomiting lightly, and it was left to Prudence's mother to clean it up. After hours passed, Dr. Peepee only said that Prudence's family, especially her husband, were rude, and Prudence's stomach ballooned grotesquely, and she was spitting up blood. She began fighting for her breath, and finally the village members decided that they would take her back home to the village to die. 3 days after the surgery, she died. This is a woman named Shamisha. She married at 19 and was thrilled when she became pregnant. Her girlfriends all congratulated her, and they all prayed she would be blessed with a son. When she went into labor, no baby emerged. 4 days of obstructed labor, Shamisha was barely conscious. Her neighbors carried her for hours to the nearest road and put her on a bus when one finally arrived. The bus took another 2 days to get to the nearest hospital, and by then the baby was dead. When Shamisha began to recover in the village, she found that she was crippled and leaking urine and feces. She was shattered and humiliated by the constant smell of her waste. Her parents and husband saved $10 to pay a public bus to take her back to the hospital in hope that her fistula could be repaired. When the bus came along, the other passengers took one whiff of her and complained, "We shouldn't have to ride next to someone who stinks like that. We paid for this ride. You can't make us put up with that stink. Put her off." The bus driver returned Shamisha's $10 and ordered her off the bus. Any prospect of repair vanished. Shamisha's husband then abandoned her. Her parents stood by her, but they built a separate hut for her because they could not abide her odor. Every day they brought her food and water and tried to reassure her. Shamisha stayed in that hut alone, ashamed, helpless. By one estimate, 90% of fistula patients have contemplated suicide. And Shamisha, too, decided that she wanted to die. I can't pronounce her whole name, so I'll call her Maha, who grew up in western Ethiopia. She was trying to find work for her family, and instead of being found work, she got sold for $10 to a 60-year-old man to become his second wife. And in rural Ethiopia, this is considered okay. They can be sold to do labor and to become second and third wives. But it's becoming less common, but this is a rural area, so the traditions stay longer. And the first wife would beat her up, hurt her, and eventually she became pregnant. And she fled the town, but her immediate family did not want her there because she was pregnant and belonged to this other guy, so they wouldn't have her. And she tried to drown herself, but her uncle found her and took her back and let him stay in her hut. And she was being abused by her husband. His first wife was beating her all the time. But they would tell her to go back because that's her husband. She has to stay there. Doesn't matter. She couldn't afford a midwife, so she tried to have the baby herself. But her pelvis hadn't grown large enough to accommodate the baby's head. And the baby was stuck in her birth passage. And after 7 days, she fell unconscious. And at some point, someone summoned a birth attendant. So we don't know how long she stayed that way. By then, the baby had been wedged there for so long that the tissues between the baby's head and her pelvis had lost circulation and rotted away. When she recovered consciousness, the baby was dead, and she had no control over her bladder or her bowels. And she couldn't even stand because of the nerve damage. And people said she was cursed because of this. And they said that she couldn't stay there. And even though the uncle wanted to help, his wife that said that it was sacrilegious because she was obviously cursed by God. So she urged her husband to take her outside into the wild and leave her to be eaten by the animals. So he gave his niece food and water, but he allowed the villagers to move her to a hut on the edge of the village. And then they took the door off the hut so the hyenas would get her. And after the darkness came, they were coming to try and eat her. And she could not walk because she had no more movement there. She had a stick and she waved it frantically at all the hyenas. And all night long, they circled her. And she fended them off the entire time. And she was 14 years old when that happened. So yeah, this left a very profound effect on me. I think you should check it out. I really do. I hope those passages I said at least pique some interest in it, because to me this book is important. I feel like what they're talking about is important to know, and I hope you guys check it out.